Most abandoned houses look the same. Broken windows, collapsed roofs, grass swallowing the driveway. But this house was different. From the outside, it looked almost normal. The walls were still standing. The porch hadn't fallen apart. Even the windows were still intact. It didn't look destroyed. It looked maintained, as if someone had been quietly taking care of it. But the strangest part wasn't the house itself. It was the way people in town reacted when you mentioned it. Some refused to talk about it. Others would just shake their heads and change the subject. One man finally said something that made the entire place feel different. He leaned closer and whispered, "That house isn't abandoned." Then he paused for a moment before adding something even stranger. "Someone still goes there." At first, I thought he was joking, until I arrived at the house and saw the path in the grass, a path that hadn't been there very long. And the front door? Already open. Most abandoned houses look the same. Broken windows, collapsed roofs, tall grass slowly swallowing the driveway until the road itself disappears into weeds and dirt. Time usually leaves its mark on places like that, slowly stripping away the details that once made them feel like homes. Paint peels away from the walls, doors hang crooked on rusted hinges, and the silence around them feels natural, like the world has simply accepted that nobody belongs there anymore. But the house I'm about to tell you about was different. From the outside, it didn't look like the kind of place time had destroyed. In fact, the first thing that stood out about it was how normal it looked. The walls were still standing straight, the siding faded but not falling apart. The porch stretched across the front of the house with its railing still intact, the wooden boards beneath it worn but solid. Even the windows were still in place, dusty but unbroken, reflecting the trees and sky around them like quiet mirrors. If you were driving past the property quickly, you might assume someone still lived there. It didn't look abandoned in the way most abandoned houses do. It looked maintained, not freshly repaired or cleaned, not modern or recently painted, but preserved. Like someone had been quietly making sure it didn't fall apart. Like someone had been coming back just often enough to keep it standing exactly the way it was. But the strangest part about the house wasn't the way it looked. It was the way people in town reacted whenever you mentioned it. I didn't even know the house existed until the day I arrived in the area. The town itself was small, the kind of place where the same buildings had been standing for decades, and everyone seemed to know each other. There was a single gas station near the edge of the highway, an old diner across the street, and a few quiet roads stretching out into farmland and forest. I had stopped at the gas station first, mostly to ask for directions. The place looked like it hadn't changed much in years. The counter was made of dark wood worn smooth from thousands of hands resting on it over time, and behind it stood an old refrigerator humming quietly in the corner. The walls were covered with faded signs advertising brands that had probably been popular 20 years ago. A man stood behind the counter when I walked in, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, reading something on a small folded newspaper. He looked up when the door chimed. At first the conversation was normal. I bought a drink, made some small talk about the weather, the road conditions, the usual things travelers ask when they pass through a place they've never been before. Then I asked if he knew about an old house outside town. I described the road I had seen on a map, the narrow dirt road that disappeared into the trees a few miles outside the highway. The moment I mentioned it, something about his expression changed. Not dramatically. He didn't panic or react loudly. But the way he paused told me immediately that he knew exactly what house I was talking about. For a few seconds he didn't say anything. He just watched me carefully, like he was trying to figure something out. Then he asked a question I hadn't expected. "Why do you want to go there?" His tone wasn't angry or suspicious. It was something else. Something closer to concern. I told him the truth. I explore abandoned places. Old houses, forgotten buildings, places that have slowly been left behind by time. Sometimes it's interesting history. Sometimes it's just curiosity about the lives people once lived inside those walls. Usually when I explain that, people find it fascinating. Some even give suggestions about places nearby that might be worth seeing. But the man behind the counter didn't smile. He didn't seem impressed or amused. Instead, he folded the newspaper slowly and set it aside, resting both hands on the counter as he looked directly at me. There was a moment of silence before he spoke again. "That house isn't abandoned," he said. I remember letting out a small laugh when he said it. Not because I thought he was lying, but because the photos I had seen of the place made it look completely empty. The windows were dusty. The paint looked old. The grass around the property had grown tall enough to reach the bottom of the porch railing. Everything about it suggested the house had been sitting there untouched for years. But the man didn't laugh with me. He just shook his head slowly. "People think it's abandoned," he continued, his voice quieter now. "But that doesn't mean nobody goes there." I asked him what he meant. For a moment, it looked like he might answer. His eyes shifted briefly toward the window beside the counter, where the highway stretched out beyond the parking lot. Cars passed by occasionally, the sound of their tires fading quickly as they disappeared down the road. When he looked back at me, his expression had changed again. Not nervous exactly, just distant, like he had decided something was better left unsaid. "If you're looking for it," he finally said, "take the second dirt road past the bridge." He paused again, then added quietly, "You'll find it." I waited for him to say more, but he didn't. The conversation ended there. I finished my drink, thanked him for the directions, and walked back outside. The air felt warmer than it had before. Or maybe it just felt different because of the conversation. The man's words stayed in my mind longer than I expected. That house isn't abandoned. Someone still goes there. At the time, I assumed he was exaggerating. Maybe a local rumor, the kind small towns tend to create around old buildings that have been empty for too long. Every place seems to have a story like that. A house people talk about but rarely visit. A place that gathers rumors simply because it sits quietly for years without anyone explaining what really happened there. Still, the way the man said it had felt serious. Not dramatic. Not like a ghost story meant to scare someone away. Just matter of fact. As if he was stating something obvious. 10 minutes later, I was driving down the road he had described. The bridge came first, a narrow structure crossing a shallow stream surrounded by thick trees. The second dirt road appeared exactly where he said it would, barely visible at first because of the tall grass growing along its edges. I slowed the car and turned onto it, gravel crunching beneath the tires as the trees closed in on both sides of the road. The farther I drove, the quieter everything became. Pine branches hung low over the path, occasionally brushing the roof of the car as I passed beneath them. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in narrow beams, shifting slowly across the gravel as the wind moved the branches overhead. The road stretched on for almost half a mile before the trees finally opened up, and that's when I saw the house. It stood alone in the center of a wide clearing, exactly where the photos had shown it. Silent. Still. Waiting. But the moment I saw it in person, something immediately felt different. Because the grass around the property was tall, except for one narrow path leading from the gravel road directly to the front porch. A path where the grass had been flattened. Recently. At first, I thought he was joking. From every photo I had seen, the place looked completely empty. Dusty windows reflected the sky like dull mirrors. The paint on the siding had faded under years of sun and rain, and tall grass had grown around the edges of the porch like nature had slowly started reclaiming the property. Nothing about the house suggested that anyone still visited it. In fact, it looked like the kind of place that had been quietly forgotten, left behind as newer homes were built closer to town and the older ones slowly faded into the background. But the man at the gas station hadn't smiled when he said it. He hadn't laughed or tried to make the moment sound mysterious. He had simply said it in a calm, serious voice, like he was telling me something obvious that everyone else already understood. Someone still goes there. That sentence stayed in my mind as I drove down the narrow gravel road outside town. The farther I drove, the quieter everything became. The highway noise faded behind me, replaced by the sound of tires crunching slowly over loose gravel. Tall pine trees lined both sides of the road, their branches leaning inward like they were closing off the path behind me as I moved deeper into the woods. Sunlight filtered through the branches in thin, shifting beams, creating moving patterns across the road ahead. Occasionally, the wind would stir the trees just enough for the leaves to whisper softly above the car, but otherwise the place felt unusually still. The bridge appeared first, exactly where the man had said it would be. It crossed a shallow stream that flowed slowly through the forest, the water barely making any sound as it moved between smooth stones. On the other side of the bridge, the road curved slightly, and about 100 yards farther down I saw the second dirt road branching off to the right. It looked easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The entrance was narrow, with tall grass growing along both sides, and the gravel there looked less traveled than the main road behind me. I slowed the car and turned onto it, the tires sinking slightly into the uneven surface as the trees grew thicker around the path. Pine branches hung low over the road, occasionally brushing across the roof of the car with a soft scraping sound. The farther I drove, the darker the road seemed to become as the sunlight struggled to reach the ground beneath the heavy canopy of trees. For a moment, I wondered if the house might be farther away than I expected, but then the trees suddenly opened up. The road widened slightly, and the forest gave way to a large clearing. And there it was. The house stood alone in the center of the open space, exactly as it had appeared in the photos I had seen online. 2 stories tall with faded white siding and a narrow porch stretching across the front. The roofline was straight and solid, not sagging the way most abandoned houses eventually do. The windows were dusty but intact, reflecting the sky and the trees surrounding the clearing. At first glance, nothing about the place looked particularly unusual. If anything, the house looked too normal. That was the first detail that felt strange. Most abandoned houses show obvious signs of decay. Broken glass, collapsed sections of roof, doors hanging open on rusted hinges. But this house looked like it had been quietly preserved. Not renovated or freshly repaired, but maintained just enough that it hadn't fallen apart. The porch steps were still solid. The railing stood straight along the edges of the porch without any missing boards. Even the front door looked undamaged. It was slightly faded, like the rest of the house, but it didn't look broken or warped from years of weather. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing and stepped out slowly, taking a moment to look around. The silence there felt heavier than it had on the road. No birds were flying overhead. No insects buzzed through the tall grass around the clearing. Even the wind seemed to avoid the open space around the house. Everything was still. The tall grass surrounding the property swayed gently along the edges of the clearing where the forest met the open ground, but the area directly around the house looked different. The grass there was tall as well, growing thick and uneven in most places, except for one narrow line that stretched from the gravel road all the way to the front porch. I noticed it immediately. A path. At first it looked like nothing more than a strip of flattened grass cutting through the clearing. But when I walked closer, it became obvious that it hadn't formed naturally. The grass in that line had been pressed down by footsteps. Not a single footprint, not the scattered marks of animals passing through the field. This was a clear path where someone had walked the same route more than once. And the grass hadn't had time to stand back up yet, which meant the person who had walked it had been here recently. That was the moment the man's words came back to me again. Someone still goes there. I stood there quietly for a moment, looking at the house again with that thought in mind. Suddenly, the building didn't feel as empty as it had before. The windows still reflected the sky and the trees, giving no hint of movement behind the dusty glass. But the idea that someone might have been here not long ago made the silence feel different. I followed the path slowly, my shoes pressing the flattened grass slightly deeper as I walked toward the porch. The ground beneath the grass felt firm, like it had been walked on enough times that the soil had started to pack down along the route. When I reached the base of the porch steps, I noticed something else that felt strange. The front door wasn't completely closed. It was slightly open, just enough to leave a narrow gap between the door and the frame. A thin line of darkness stretched along the edge where the door had been left ajar. For a moment, I stood there staring at it. The door didn't move in the wind because there was almost no wind at all in the clearing. It simply remained where it was, slightly open, like someone had stepped inside and forgotten to close it all the way. The porch boards creaked softly beneath my feet as I stepped onto them. The sound echoed faintly in the quiet clearing behind me. Up close, the house still looked surprisingly well preserved. The wood beneath the porch felt sturdy. The railing didn't wobble when I placed my hand on it. Even the paint on the door, though faded, hadn't chipped away the way it usually does after years of exposure. I reached the door slowly and placed my hand against it. The wood felt cool beneath my fingers. When I pushed gently, the door swung inward without resistance. The hinges didn't scream or groan the way old hinges usually do. Instead, they moved quietly, almost silently, as the door opened just enough for me to see inside the house. The air that drifted out felt cooler than the warm afternoon outside. Dust floated in thin rays of sunlight that entered through the windows, hanging in the air like tiny particles suspended in time. The living room sat directly in front of the entrance, and the first thing I noticed was that the furniture was still there. A couch stood against one wall, facing a small wooden table. A chair rested beside the window. Everything looked neat, arranged the way someone might leave a room when they planned to return later. Nothing had been knocked over or destroyed. Nothing looked like it had been disturbed in years, except for one detail sitting on the table in the center of the room. A clear glass of water, half full. The surface of the water was perfectly still, and beside the table, pressed clearly into the dust on the wooden floor, was a single footprint that hadn't been there very long.